Jazakallah khair, Shehzad bhai. Was an amazing presentation. Allah bless you. So right here, I have previous question also on the previous slides, but I forgot those. So just focusing on here. We know that these are two different stages and eras. And according to this slide, it seems like the pre-prophethood era and post-prophethood era, we should not be taking those commands, particularly post-prophethood era. But as historical facts, we know that prophets, Sahabah, they went to those places even after Prophet ﷺ's death,
right,
to implicate his commands while he was gone.
Right.
So could you please
okay.
explain that?
So you see, I can also illustrate this by a short diagram. So this is the Arabian Peninsula. This is the African Horn, the Asian Horn, and this is the African part. It's like this. So it goes like this. So we have Abyssinia here, we have Yemen here, we have Hijaz here, which Hijaz actually is the place where Makkah and Medina are. So in the 6th year of the Prophet's ministry, he wrote letters to 12 rulers, and all these 12 rulers were on the periphery of Arabia, and they were actually delivered the same message as was delivered to the people of Mecca and Medina themselves. So these were the areas which were lying on the periphery of Arabia, and the Prophet, because he was stationed in Medina at that time, he sent them letters and he said that, well, I have been sent to these people, but I'm going to come to you as well. So my own message is being delivered now in Arabia today, and for you also, you need to watch out that if you deny the truth intentionally, then you shall be taken to task, because you being individuals for whom the truth has the same value as the people of the book of your area. So therefore, you would also be called to account, because your own books, for example, we know that the Christians who were residing there, their own books predicted the arrival of the last prophet. So for them, the last prophet was not someone new. So they already had knowledge of the last prophet, that he would come amongst Arabia. So once he arrived, he just announced his arrival as part of what was found in their own predictions. Similarly was the case with the Jews and people who were bordering in these territories. So the Prophet was an introduced personality to them. He was no one new. He just announced that I am the same person whom your own books are speaking of. So I am going through my ministry. So you still have time, because these were sent in the 6th Hijrah, and we know that the Sahabah attacked them in the 13th Hijrah. So they had 7 years. So in these 7 years, they had all the time to come to the Prophet, talk to him, verify whether he's the one who was spoken of in their own scriptures, go back and then do whatever they would like. So they had those 7 years, and those 7 years was the time in which the Prophet was living, at least in 6 of them, because he died in 12 Hijrah. So he was living in those 6 years. They had all the time to come to him. But as far as his message was concerned, so not only was it communicated to Makkah and Medina, but it went to them as well. So the only thing was that the Sahaba, they just completed what the Prophet had begun. It's not something that they did afresh. The Prophet had already delivered the truth to them. He had already warned them that he had come in response to the prophecies that they are there. And they had the time to come to him and also witness the lesser day of judgment, which was going to take place in Arabia. For them, it was, again, as I said, the Old Testament. It's not my topic here, but I can show you that in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, these lesser days of judgment are also depicted in the very same way as they are depicted in the Quran. So you also find in the Old Testament exactly the same story, exactly the same theme. So in accordance with that, the Sahaba were told that the Prophet himself, of course, did not live to see that, but he had done his job. He had communicated the truth to them in ultimate form in response to the predictions that were there in the Bible, in the Old and the New Testaments. And also they had those 6 years in which they could come and verify or ask questions or raise objections. So once he passed away, the Sahaba only finished what he had already done. Had he lived, he would have done it himself maybe, but because the Almighty had other plans, he died, and in the next couple of years, the Sahaba actually just completed the task that was, assigned to the Prophet himself. So this is how it happened. It's not that they did it themselves. It's not that they extended their territory. It was basically which the Prophet already had initiated, in fact finished. It was just the final part which was left to the Prophet. Remember, I explained to you that in the times of the messengers of God, in the prophetic era, the task of punishment was generally assigned to tempests, earthquakes, or the elements of nature. But in the time of the last messenger, this was replaced by the swords of the believers. So the punishment which was meted out in the prophetic era, in the earlier times, through natural disasters. This was the natural disasters part was replaced by the swords of the believers, and this is how this actually happened. That those believers, which were the Sahabah, they undertook this task and they finished off what the Prophet actually had initiated.
But with that, then by that explanation, one would argue that the message has already been brought and has continued, for example, for us, and so the message is ongoing for the other people as well, and therefore we can continue to keep doing.
Yes, that's a very brilliant question, and that is exactly how fiqh has generally actually taken it from. So this is how our scholars view it, and they say that because the Prophet had done his job, so therefore if they had conquered this territory or punished people, so we would continue doing that. And this is precisely how Osama bin Laden and the rest of the lot have argued. But you see, the Quran has made this point. It says, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا, that this punishment can only be given by the Prophet himself, until the presence of the Prophet is there, because he is the one who is going to deliver the truth. In his absence, the truth becomes vague. In his absence, the truth has to be re-established. So yes, there are other areas, but punishment cannot be given in the absence of a messenger of God. That is what the Quran says. And that is why I said that you have to realize in the prophetic era, remember this prophetic era, God takes matters in his own hands. He sends his envoys. They deliver the truth. They have miracles to show. They have so many things in which they are ideals of humanity. They are morally so pure that you can really vouch for them. But in the post-prophetic era, people like us are delivering the truth. So we cannot be in any way, we are far from perfect in this way. We are not messengers of God. So the Almighty says that this punishment is only authorized when messengers are there. Why? Because the truth is made evident by them in its ultimate form. And people who deny the truth, they deserve punishment. But in the post-prophetic era, we cannot deliver the truth in its ultimate form because we are not messengers of God. So only in the areas in which the Prophet sent this message, and that too, remember, they are the ones who were actually waiting for his arrival. So they were given this chance of 7 years to come to him and verify this claim, or otherwise, and discuss with him. But since the passing away of the messenger, this facility is no longer there. The messenger is no longer there. So it cannot be extended beyond this era. Once he had passed away, now it was all curtains. You could only continue to the time, maybe a couple of years, like 10, 15 years, in which the task was completed, in which the truth had been unveiled, and now the Sahaba were only punishing them. So once that punishment was finished for those 12 countries, so there were these 12 countries, and they have been actually outlined, Bahrain and some of the other countries. So these 12 countries, once had been finished off, or maybe the truth had been delivered, beyond them they could not step. So if you read history, you'll find that once some of the soldiers tried to cross beyond those 12 countries, he was stopped in the times of Umar radiallahu anhu. He said that no, you cannot go beyond this, because this is the territory which has been outlined. This is the territory in which the Prophet himself was present. But once you go beyond that, for example, if you go into Sindh, because at that time, you know that within the first 60 years, Muhammad bin Qasim stepped into Asia. But then that was the era beyond that, the prophetic rule, and in which he did not account for those 12 countries as well. So this was a very specific area, and this could not have gone beyond that.
I think rather than saying that the life or the death of the Prophet, I think if we could define it, if they rejected the direct message or direct command of Rasulullah, then they would have been, committing a sin.
But since that can happen even today, so we have to specify.
Direct message from the messenger.
Yeah, you mean the direct addressees, exactly. The immediate addressees. So that's what I'm saying. The immediate addressees who are present in the time of the messenger of God. So only they can be punished. Beyond them, you cannot go that, because you see, as the Quran repeatedly says, only God through his messengers is able to do that. No one other has this authority. Yes. Yes, sir.
Same line of thought, you same line of thought the ladies have been asking. So the four Khulafa Rashidin, whose era finished 32 years, and then Muawiyah's time starts. Does this, I'm finding hard to make this extension or the order finishes by the Khulafa Rashidin, or it continues?
Actually, it continues in the first 60 years. I mean, that is the time when the era of the Sahaba were in power. So once they were deposed, I mean, the people who came after them, who were the Tabi'un. So once we entered the era of the Tabi'un, this no longer was the case. But let me also point this out, that our traditional scholars, they don't recognize this fact. So since they don't accept this law, I mean, what I've just described is something which Ustaz Amiruddin Farahi has pointed out for the first time. Because they don't acknowledge this, because they think that if the Prophet was, alive and he had done his message, then it was for all times to come. So even today we can attack people or kill people the way the Quran has mentioned them. So by not recognizing this law, virtually we think that we are still living in the prophetic era. So our common scholars would say that the prophetic era started with Adam. It's not going to end with Prophet Muhammad, the way I'm explaining. They say, on the contrary, this prophetic era is going to extend to the day of judgment. So it's like saying that right until the day of judgment, we are still living in the prophetic era. And whatever the Prophet did in his own times is still applicable to our era. So this is how our common scholars explain this.
Without the presence of the Prophet?
Even without the presence, because he said that he did his job. So once he did his job, that is for all times to come. So our traditional thought makes us, it takes us to this extent that we are still living in the prophetic era. The Prophet's message was universal, and that universality actually demands that we just not restrict him to his death, and we have it extended to the whole, era within human history. And this is where the Farahi school diverges. It says that we have to realize that punishment can only be given to people who are living in the prophetic era. It cannot be extended for reasons which I have just explained. So in a nutshell, you can say our traditional scholars would do exactly all the things which messengers of God were authorized in the post-prophetic era, because for them there is no post-prophetic era, in fact. Every era is a prophetic era for them.
But if that's the case, then how do you explain the verses about freedom of religion and, the differentiation between the prophetic and the non-prophetic era?
So you see, as far as these verses are concerned, like La ikraha fid deen, there is no compulsion in religion, that is that no one is going to force you to accept this. So what they mean is that you have your own choice to accept the truth or whatever you think it is. But if you do accept what the truth is not, or what is the untruth, then you're going to face the consequences. It doesn't mean that you're not going to face the consequences. The freedom is regarding the choice that you make.
No, but you face the consequences on the day of judgment,
Right.
not from the people, punishing you because you don't.
So this is an exception to that. So the La ikraha fid deen verse actually relates to the Sharia part of our religion, in which this prophetic era is not invoked. So we are talking about the post-prophetic era. So in the prophetic era, there was no such thing as La ikraha fid deen. It was La ikraha fid deen as long as you had the choice to accept or not accept. Otherwise, their fate was decided in this world. However, today, the way the things are, we have this choice to accept or not accept. Fate is just going to be deferred. It's just a question of shortening that span. In their times, the span was, let's say, 25 years or 30 years, and for us, it's like forever.
Sorry, I don't keep going. In terms of the traditional scholars, how do they explain the verses that say, you can continue killing non-Muslims, and the verses that say, you have freedom?
Like Rafiddin.
Right, so
Yeah, because
that's
so see, they say that this is what the Prophet said earlier on. Initially in Makkah, when his ministry was going on and there was no state created, so this choice was given to them. But once this choice was finished, it had a particular time bar to it. So once that time was reached, this could not be invoked again. So they related to a particular time bar.
So this doesn't apply to.
It does not today for them.
Okay.
This is a question that we need to ask them, that why is it that you find these verses in the Quran today and though you don't give the choice to people?
So the same verse, lakum dinukum waliya din, right?
So
That is the same thing
No, actually, Surah Kafiroon's verse has a very different ring to it. People think that it's basically a verse of tolerance. In fact, if you look at the context of the surah and the placement of the surah in this chapter in which it is placed, you'll find it's actually a verse of acquittal. It's like saying, okay, to you what you do, and to us is what we are going to do. It's not said in a tolerant way. It is said in a way that, okay, then you'll face the consequences. If you're doing whatever you do, then the consequences are to be faced by yourself. So generally this verse has been interpreted as a verse of tolerance, but in fact it is not a verse of tolerance. It only says that, okay, then wait for what was going to happen.
You did mention that how the structure helps the topic.
Right.
So in the same way, does the style also help the topic?
Absolutely. Because see, when the style of the Quran is in the form of a dialogue or a monologue or a sermon, so you see, you can see how the Quran or the Prophet of God is communicating his message to people, and he has been given this distinction that he is talking to different people at the same time. So when the Quran was rearranged in this form, this distinction was actually made, in which the people of the book were made to the addressees in the Medinan period and the idolaters in the Meccan period. But when the Prophet himself was there, he was talking to both of them. So at times when he was in Medina, he was also speaking about the Mushrikeen, which he had left behind in Mecca. So in his own ministry, it was taking place at times simultaneously. But once when the Quran was rearranged in the form of a book and chapterization was given, so in that chapterization, the addressees were bifurcated.
Thank you, Dr. Saleem. It was very interesting talk. Very thought-provoking. I have many questions, but maybe I'll restrict to one for now. Mm-hmm. And this relates to your initial part of presentation regarding, you mentioned that Quran is a dialogue.
Right.
So to my understanding, dialogue is between two folks. Like there's
so actually, as I said,
towards the end you did mention that it's a monologue, and monologue is maybe a subset of dialogue. So your initial premise,
right.
Is dialogue.
So what I was trying to explain was it's a book of conversation. So for lack of a better word, what I was trying to implement or hint at, that it's a back and forth conversation. So it's not always back and forth. At times you'll find a particular person speaking, and you don't find the response being given by the addressee. But there are several instances in the Quran in which you'll find that it's a back and forth dialogue as well. So, but it's not always the case. So at times the dialogue is two-way. I mean, there are two people speaking, and at times it's just like a monologue or a sermon in which the Prophet is speaking, and it's a very long, lengthy speech. But then at the end of the speech, you'll find either a response from the addressees, or it may be a silence, because, as I said, the scene shifts to a new scenario. So remember, the Quran is not just a book of dialogues. It's also a book in which acts and scenes change, in which the scenario changes. For example, the Battle of Badr would be taking place, and suddenly the battle would end, and there would be a comment on the battle by the Almighty Himself, and something new would be brought up. For example, the believers or the disbelievers would have said, or the hypocrites to be precise, that why should we spend out of our own pocket so much? And the Prophet would tell them that this is a loan that you're giving to the Almighty, and it's going to be returned manifold back to you. So at times what happens is that the questions are raised within that monologue, and once that whole monologue is completed, it's not like a back and forth within the monologue. That sermon would be complete, and then there would be a cumulative response, like a comprehensive response. So it covers all these things. When I say a book of dialogue, I mean it refers to a monologue, a speech, a conversation, a back and forth sort of thing. But the point that I was actually trying to make were two. One, that only people who figure in that dialogue will be there. I mean, you cannot expect Hindus and people living in other areas of the world also figuring in that conversation, because it was a living dialogue between entities who were present. And two, the disjointedness in the Quran that we often feel is not because the topics are disjointed, but because the dialogue personnel change. And when they change, then they have their own peculiar background in which they're talking about a specific topic, which might not relate to the previous topic in a direct way.
Another question related to, I think, this discussion is, you mentioned prophetic era and then post-prophetic era. So prophets before our final prophet, the people who followed them or didn't follow, they were given, explicit punishment, and the believers were spared. But in the case of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we see there were battles, for example, Badr, where both some of the Muslims, the believers, they also martyred or they were killed on Uhud, which was the second battle where actually we lost, the Muslims lost.
Right.
So it is not as explicit as was in the previous prophets.
Right. So for them, the Quran actually explained that for them it is like life itself, and martyrdom itself is the greatest life that you can get in the hereafter. It is the highest form of life itself. So although they were killed in those battles and they, of course, sacrificed their own lives, and as such you could say that they were not rewarded in this world, but they had that ultimate reward which martyrdom carries. So shahadat or martyrdom has that ultimate reward that the Quran says, bal ahya'un walakin la tashurun, that they are living in God's presence. You might not be knowing what their life is, and at the same time this is the highest status that you can imagine about people who die.
This does not apply to people of previous prophets.
So of course that was not the case, because for them the destruction took place of the whole nation, because for them a very large part of the nation ended up denying the Prophet, and there were very few believers in most cases, and they were sifted out, and all of them lived, because of course they couldn't have been left to the mercy of those disasters.
I remembered my question. You were saying that there will be denial in, directly to the command of Prophet. Then there will be disaster for them or punishment for them. This is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or this is how Allah has established His style, right? So when we see Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life, and we know that he was kicked out from Makkah, went to Medina, and served the people over there, and then he came back to Makkah, the Fatahun Mubin, right? That day when he gave the kind of universal forgiveness to everyone,
right.
Hindu, idolaters,
and the people of the book,
Munafiqeen, everyone, right? So does this contradicts by any means to the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
So that's also a very good question. Actually, this was the time when the Itmam ul-Hujjah process was still going on. So the truth was still being communicated, and they were still being given this respite. So the Surah Tawbah verse, which actually, that they still had a chance. So they were living in that respite period. So remember, when the Almighty destroys people, He does not do so immediately. He gives them that chance, that opportunity to reconsider. And so the time that you're talking about was that particular period in which that opportunity still was there, that you could have your way, the way the Almighty said. But once that time expired, which was the time around the 10th Hijrah or the 9th Hijrah, when that final Hajj took place, when the Surah Tawbah says that وَأَذَانُ مِنَ اللَّهِ إِلَى يَوْمِ النَّاسِ حَجِّ الْأَكْبَرِ, that in the time of the Hajj Akbar, you'll relate this to all these disbelieving nations, all these mushriks, that their time is now up. So this actually came a year after Fatah Makkah, almost a year after that.
So then there was any killing?
There was not, because all of them accepted faith, except a couple of them.
Like Hinda, Prophet said, don't come to my... She accepted Islam.
She accepted Islam later on.
So how does the Quran clarify? Which laws are to be in the prophetic era and the pre-prophetic era? So how does it say? How do I know as a lay reader that this applies only to the prophets and this applies to
Right. So remember, I just explained a little while ago that there are three areas which are specific to the prophetic era. All verses which deal with the punishment of polytheism. You cannot apply them today. Similarly, all verses which deal with the punishment of disbelief, which is kufr, you cannot apply them today, because this is something which only God can punish. He did so in the times of His prophets, and He'll do so in the day of judgment. And apostasy, which is... So these are the three areas which are specific to the prophetic era. All the rest of the Quran, as I said, it has so much to offer. For example, verses on morality, verses on faith, verses which remind us to be good individuals. So they're all there, and the very context reminds us that it's for all times to come for everyone. However, wherever these three punishments are concerned, discussed, not just polytheism, but the punishment for polytheism, not just disbelief, because disbelief is discussed at a number of occasions, but the punishment for disbelief and the punishment of apostasy. So wherever the punishment of these three crimes are concerned, the Almighty makes it clear that He says that only I have the prerogative to punish them. I did so in the era of my messengers of God, and I'm going to do it again on the day of judgment. But in the post-prophetic era, this is something which is confined to the prophetic era. In the prophetic era, God says, I did it. I didn't do it directly. I did it through my envoys, my representatives who are messengers of God. I'm going to do it again on the day of judgment. But this era, which is the post-prophetic era, no one is authorized to do so, because this is the prerogative of a messenger of God, because he's my representative.
So if that is clear in that Quran, then where is that discrepancy where people like Osama bin Laden, they sort of take it upon themselves?
Yes, so that's another very good question. That you see, what has happened is that unfortunately this law has been presented in the form of a dialogue. Remember, one of the difficulties of the Quran is that I just explained to you that at times the dialogue and the monologue and the sermons which take place, when they are directed towards individuals, and when you have, for example, the words in the Quran like for example, you say, Ya ayyuhan nas, O people. So what has happened is that at times in the context of the Quran, the word an-nas does not mean mankind. I talk to you, I say, oh people. So when I'm saying, oh people, I'm not referring to people who are outside this room. I'm just referring to people who are in front of me. So verses like Ya ayyuhan nas became a cause of this misconception, because people thought it was a universal directive. So everyone is included. Whereas, of course, in context, an-nas means, or people mean the people the Prophet was talking to. So this is one of the reasons. There were several other as well. And the style of the Quran, if not understood the way I just explained through the works of my teachers, then you would have this confusion still existing. And because they think that an-nas is a common word, it means people. So therefore, and another thing is that they say that the example of the Prophet is the best example. لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. So whatever he did, we have to follow. So they make a generalized statement. So if he killed, we're going to kill. If he was affectionate, we're going to be affectionate. But after a certain time, we will not be affectionate. So they follow the Prophet exactly without realizing that there were certain things which were specific to him.
So it seems like there's no direct ayah that would explain this.
There are several verses. For example, in Surah Yunus it says, وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٌ فَإِذَا جَاءَ رَسُولُهُمْ قُضِيَ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ, which means that for every nation there is a messenger. وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٌ فَإِذَا جَاءَ رَسُولُهُم. So when their messenger comes, قُضِيَ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ, their matter is decided in this world and no one is wronged. So you see, there are so many verses in the Quran which actually speak of this law, but somehow it has eluded human understanding, I would say. And one of the reasons for that is also that I may point out that the Quran has seldom remained the means of deliberation in our Muslim Ummah. You will find very few Quranic scholars. Even today, our madrasas, the senior most person in the madrasa is called a Shaykh al-Hadith. He's not called a Shaykh al-Quran. So you see, unfortunately, in the last 14 centuries, the Quran has seldom remained the object of deliberation. It has mostly been used to read for the departed souls, like just to give them reward, or to maybe do some other random things, but it has seldom been used to obtain guidance from or to research on. Because, as I said, this is an unfortunate happening which took place very earlier on. And even today, if we reflect on our own lives, if you look at the madrasas, because I have this experience of talking to the madrasa people as well, the Quran does not figure in their discourse. It's just read as a translation at times, and that too in a recent introduction. Otherwise, formerly, the Quran was basically used to memorize, so that it could be read in the Taraweeh prayers, and that is all. Even the memorizer himself, the Hafiz himself, would not know what he's reading about. So unfortunately, this treatment of the Quran from us is the main reason why it took 14 centuries maybe for a person like Farai Saab to come and point this out. Otherwise, it is so apparent that it would have been done much earlier, I would have supposed, by earlier scholars, had the Quran become the object of direct deliberation. Yes?
Regarding the division of 7 chapters. So should we say that this is like a general trend, that the first 2 chapters they're addressing the people of the book, and the other 5 are addressing.
Yes, it's a general trend. Otherwise, we have in between we have addressing the other denomination as well. But the general trend is that the people of the book are addressed. Surah Tawbah is a combined surah in which all these, because it's the final surah.
But Surah Muhammad also, if you look at it, it's also very explicit.
Yes, it does. It expresses the Mushrikeen actually.
Yeah.
So Surah Muhammad is, as you can see, it's a surah which is
It also talks about punishment, like killing their maxims.
It does. So that's what I'm saying. You see, at times there's this cross-referencing as well, but broadly, from chapter number 7 to chapter number 2, you'll find the idolaters being discussed broadly. So Surah 47 actually falls in the other line.
And Surah Hashr, for example, I think that talks about.
It also talks about the people of the book. Yes. So there are instances. You see, within a chapter, you have the Medinan and the Meccan surahs both. So don't forget that. So there are Meccan surahs and there are Medinan surahs. In the Meccan surahs, you'll find the idolaters being discussed, and in the Medinan surahs, you'll find the people of the book being discussed. So it is not that all the chapters have just the Meccan surahs or just the Medinan surahs. They are always an amalgam of Meccan and Medinan surahs.
Another example is Surah Anfal, just before Tawbah.
Right. So
It's talking about Mushrikeen.
yeah, that's it. Yes. It is in spite of the fact that they are placed in the second group or the second chapter.
So, but then it's really a general trend. It's not that.
I mean, the point that I'm trying to make is that in the Meccan surahs of each chapter, you'll find the idolaters being discussed, and in the Medinan you'll find the people of the book being discussed. But in the 7th to the 2nd chapter, a bulk of that chapter in general discusses the people of the book. Of course, it does not preclude the idolaters, because there are Medinan surahs and there are Meccan surahs. So if there are no other questions, we can wrap it up? Okay.
I have some questions.
Please.
First of all, I thank you for explaining so elaborately, and it put a good understanding of reading the Quran. My question is, unfortunately, not about this topic. I think I have gained a lot from this, and you explained it so well and numerous times. So probably no question about this. But my question is another one. Two questions. One is that this day of judgment and that's only for the humanity only, or it's for rest of the creation as well?
For all people. I mean, you mean the other than human beings?
Yeah. That's the first.
Okay. So let me answer this first question. As far as the Quran is concerned, we do know that there are two types of or two categories of creatures who will be called to account. So one of them is the jinn kind, because the Quran tells us that just as messengers were sent to human beings, they were also sent to the jinn kind. So what we can know of that on the day of accountability, on the day of judgment, that human beings and the jinn kind would be brought to judgment. As far as other forms are concerned, the Quran does not discuss them, and so we should assume that if you're talking about animal life or you're talking about plant life, for them there is not going to be any judgment, because the Quran says that they have been created for the benefit of mankind. So if we kill plants, if we use plants for eating vegetables, for example, or if we kill animal beings for consumption of their meat, this is what we have been authorized by God Himself, because these two creatures or these two forms of living beings, they don't have any independent will or any independent, I would say, freedom of choice. They have been primarily created for humankind, for their consumption.
And the second question is that we don't find any prophets sent to the areas where throughout the history of humankind, most of the civilization existed in either China or India, and we don't find any traces of prophets. Instead, we find a particular area where most of the prophets.
Actually, the Quran tells us that there are a lot of prophets which it does not mention. And it only mentions those prophets about whom the people of Arabia knew, because you see, they were being addressed. And they could, in all probability, there could have been prophets sent to China or to maybe even India or to Mongolia or the Far East, but the Quran never mentioned them. So the Quran says, "Rusulan qad qasasnahum alayk wa rusulan lam naqsusum alayk." So I have mentioned prophets which existed, and the Quran says also there were many prophets which God has not mentioned in the Quran. And there is also another theory in which people think that because Hinduism started off with monotheism, I mean, they were Tawheed, they were followers of Tawheed. If you read the Veds, which is the earliest book of Hinduism, so there is this conjecture, I think, which is pretty valid, that the Prophet Noah's teaching actually reached this area through some other means, and the time also seems to be very similar when Hinduism started. So we cannot preclude other prophets from other nations. The only thing is that they have not been mentioned in the Quran, because the Quran says it only mentions those prophets which the Arabs knew, because it was meant for the Arabs to communicate it to them, because they passed by their ruins. The Ad, the Samud, and the people of the Shuaib, they all had their territories within Central Asia, within Palestine and within that area. So they were familiar with those places, and precisely for this reason they were mentioned, and some of the prophets that might have been sent to other regions were never mentioned.
I mean to say that throughout the history that even beyond Quran, we don't find traces of prophets in those areas. Why is that?
As I said, this is what history tells us, and it might not be very true, because you see, history does not hand out everything, and the Quran says that a lot of prophets were sent, which I have not mentioned in my book. This is what the Almighty says, and that's what I think, that they must have been sent to other places. It's only that the Quran does not mention them, and history does not mention them as well. But this does not mean that they did not go there. And as I said, if you talk about Hinduism, for example, it is so heavily polytheistic in nature today. But if you read the earliest books of Hinduism, which are the Veds, you'll find such beautiful monotheism being discussed that it would be as if you're reading the Quran, maybe, because there's no concept of any polytheism in the earliest books, which does show that there must have been a prophet sent to them. Maybe Noah or maybe someone else.
Yeah, right now is not the topic to discuss Hinduism. I believe that there's no such thing as Hinduism. There's Jain religion and other religions. That's like most of the regional religions evident in all parts of India. So from north to south, you find different.
So Jainism is a form of that. It's a subset.
We generally call it because of Hindus living in the Indus civilization. That's what we generalize them in the
Yes, I believe that's not correct. We should not generalize them. They are two distinct entities.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.